forest is never truly quiet. Deep within groves of ancient trees that have stood longer than any nation, the wind snakes through the canopy, carrying sounds that don't belong to any animal you know. A dry snap echoes from the shadows. Heavy footsteps follow, or perhaps it's just the silence pressing against your eardrums like a physical weight. Our minds begin to fill the voids with shapes our ancestors learned to fear long before they had the words to name them. This is the edge of the known world, where maps are mere guesswork and the shadows look like living things. Humans have moved through these woods for 15,000 years, and in all that time, they have always told the same story of a dark shape moving between the trees like smoke, a legend that refuses to stay buried. We stand at the edge of the wilderness, peering into the place where the campfire's light ends and the darkness takes over. For the Stalis people of British Columbia, it is Sasquatch. For the Lakota Sioux, it is Chianka, the great elder brother who guards the land. The names may change with the soil, but the essence of the story never wavers. It speaks of a bipedal entity, wearing the skin of humanity but wielding the raw power of the primordial wild. It is not merely a beast, but a spiritual presence, a diagnosis of our collective fear of what we cannot control. In the summer of 1924, in the shadow of Mount Street, Helens, 5 miners endured a night of pure terror. Besieged inside their log cabin, something was hurling massive stones against the walls for hours in the dead of night. They fired their guns into the dark until dawn broke. When the sun finally rose, they abandoned everything, their claims, their equipment, and their dreams of wealth, just to flee the mountain. They reported being attacked by ape men. It wasn't a tall tale told over drinks. It was a report of survival. More than 40 years later, in October 1967, at a creek bed called Bluff Creek in Northern California, 2 cowboys captured 59 seconds of film that shook the world. The grainy footage showed a hair-covered creature walking with a fluid, heavy gait, glancing back at the lens before vanishing into the deep timber. Was it a man in a suit, a relic of a prehistoric world, or something else entirely? Something existing in the liminal space between what we know and what we fear. This story isn't just about monsters. It's a story about the people who have spent their lives hunting them, those who have gone to great lengths to fake them, and those who truly need them to be real, to keep this world from being flattened by the weight of absolute knowledge. It is the puzzle of what happens when an ancient myth enters the age of cameras and newsprint, yet still finds a way to survive and thrive in a world that should have debunked it long ago. Muddy footprints, blurred shapes between the branches, and a howl in the night that makes you stop, listen, and wonder if you are truly alone. The path leads us deeper into the woods, where the shadows shroud the truth, and the mysteries begin to speak. To understand the origins of this entity, we must go back long before the first Europeans set foot on this continent, when the old growth was still the domain of inhabitants who weren't quite human. There, amidst the thick foliage of the Pacific Northwest, we find the first traces of a complex relationship between humanity and the wild. Long before the ships from Europe breached the horizon of this continent, the indigenous people already understood they were never truly alone in the labyrinth of trees. Along the Pacific coast, tribes built their villages at the jagged edge of a wilderness, so vast and ancient, it seemed to breathe with its own rhythm. They grasped a truth that the newcomers would take centuries to learn. The forest has its own inhabitants, and some of them do not wear human faces. In the worldview of the Stalis people, whose territory stretched across what we now call British Columbia, this presence was neither a ghost nor a mirage. They called the entity Sasquatch. In their tongue, the name didn't mean monster or demon in the Western sense. It simply meant the wild man, or the hairy one, a being that lived beyond the borders of the village, moving through the timber with a mastery that no natural creature could rival. To the native hunters and gatherers, Sasquatch wasn't a beast to be tracked or eradicated, unlike how medieval Europeans hunted the wolf or the dragon. Instead, they described a complex relationship, a silent acknowledgement that the forest belonged to many different kinds of entities, and humanity was merely one of them. Sasquatch existed in a middle ground, a liminal space between the world of men and something far more ancient and sacred. The legends of the Stalis weren't just about chance encounters. They described Sasquatch as an ever-present neighbor, a figure standing forever at the periphery of one's vision. This entity was said to possess abilities far beyond the limits of ordinary animals. The power to become invisible at will, to move through the deep brush without leaving a single trace, and to appear and vanish as if stepping through the seams between worlds. In the indigenous mind, these traits weren't supernatural. They were simply the ultimate survival skills of those who had mastered their environment in ways humans could never hope to learn. Their attitude towards Sasquatch was a volatile mix of fear, respect, and contemplation. Sometimes it was helpful, other times dangerous, but above all, it was always an entity to be wary of. When the first white trappers and settlers began to push into this wilderness, they brought a completely different lens, a lens of conquest and classification. They saw the massive footprints and heard the howls echoing in the dead of night, but they lacked the language to explain them. These newcomers were faced with a choice: dismiss the native stories as the primitive superstitions of those who hadn't conquered nature, or listen and wonder if their predecessors had learned something profound during 15,000 years in the old growth. The wisdom passed down through generations wasn't a biological field report on wildlife. It was a frame of reference for understanding humanity's place in a world that wasn't made just for us. The stories of Sasquatch taught them caution, awe, and humility, that the forest is never empty, even when it seems so, and that there are secrets hidden in the shadows that no man can ever fully comprehend. This recognition formed the bedrock of the myth, a sophisticated architecture that positioned humans as mere guests in a house they did not own. However, as civilization began to expand with logging camps and mines, these ancient sounds and shapes began to be filtered through the minds of men who had forgotten the primal fears of their ancestors. The true turning point began when the raw oral traditions of the tribes were translated and transformed, creating a linguistic bridge that would lead Sasquatch out of the shadows of indigenous belief and into the current of modern history. Starting with the very name the world would soon use to define the American wilderness's greatest obsession. To name a thing is to claim power over it, to transform it. For the indigenous tribes, a name was a key that unlocked the very essence of a being. But when these oral traditions finally crossed the borders of the village and bled onto the printed page, they underwent a sharpening, a refinement meant to suit the ears of the modern world. In 1929, a Canadian government official named J.W. Burns became the first to facilitate this linguistic handoff, dragging the secrets of the old growth into the light of the general public. Burns was no distant academic. He had spent years working alongside the Stalis people, listening to their accounts of encounters with wild men in the deep timber. When Burns decided to publish his findings in a magazine, he faced a linguistic crossroads: how to compress 1,000 different names and descriptions from various tribes into a single, digestible term. He chose Sasquatch. This was an anglicized version of the Stalis word Sasquatch. The shift seemed minor at the time, but it birthed a new entity in the collective psyche. It was no longer merely a denizen of the forest in the indigenous sense. It became a proper noun, a brand, a looming symbol for the mysteries of the North American wilderness. Burns likely didn't realize he was documenting something far older than his own imagination. To him, it was a discovery of folklore, but to the storytellers, it was a living reality. In the original tongue, Sasquatch carried specific layers of meaning: the wild man, the hairy one, the one who lives beyond the boundary. These names didn't describe a monster. They described a state of being, a presence that stood forever on the far side of the village fence, watching from the darkness of the canopy. The name Sasquatch quickly became a vessel for the myth, allowing the story to travel much further than the forests of British Columbia ever could. However, in this translation, something of its primal soul was altered. The modern world has a clinical hunger to classify and cage everything within biological or scientific definitions. We want to know its weight, its height, and its genus. But for those who first gave it a name, Sasquatch was never a problem of wildlife biology. This entity was an ambassador of the old growth, a physical manifestation of everything the forest represents: its bounty, its lethality, its beauty, and the humbling truth that there are things man can never tame. The transition from Sasquatch to Sasquatch marked the moment a legend stepped out of the sacred context of belief and into the glare of curiosity and analysis. It was a synthesis of a historian's record and a campfire storyteller's dread. Yet, no matter how the name was changed or distorted over time, the core of the creature remained in a place where language fails. It does not choose to live in scientific reports or on municipal maps. Its true location is far more complex than a set of coordinates on the ground. To understand why the Sasquatch has managed to evade every effort to hunt or prove its existence for centuries, we must view it not as a physical entity trapped in space, but as an eternal resident of the threshold, where the line between reality and myth begins to blur in the forest mist. This miraculous escape leads us to a deeper concept of the Sasquatch's habitat. It doesn't just dwell in the deep woods. It exists in a peculiar space. Researchers call the liminal zone an invisible doorway between what we can grasp with our senses and what belongs to the world of our most primal memories. Deep within the layers of ancient lore lies a concept known as liminality, the threshold. It is a no man's land, a hazy void between light and shadow, life and death, reality and dreams. For the indigenous peoples, the Sasquatch doesn't just live in the forest. It inhabits that very invisible threshold. It dwells where our laws of physics begin to fray and give way to something far more primordial. Imagine standing at the edge of the woods at twilight, when the sun has slipped beneath the horizon but the darkness hasn't quite taken hold. That is the hour of the Sasquatch. The Stalis describe these beings as entities existing in the liminal space between the human world and something much older. They aren't wild beasts bound by flesh and bone in the way we understand them. They are masters of concealment, capable of stepping out of this reality and vanishing into another realm in the blink of an eye. To the modern lens, the ability to vanish like smoke between the trees is often dismissed as supernatural or mere fantasy. However, in their cosmology, the worldview of the tribes, it is simply absolute mastery over one's environment. They believe the Sasquatch has the power to become invisible at will, to move without leaving a single trace, appearing and disappearing as if stepping through invisible walls between worlds. This isn't magic. It is the natural capability of beings who have become one with the spirit of the land. It is this in-between space that has shielded the Sasquatch legend from the prying eyes of science for centuries. While we scramble to find a flesh and blood specimen to lock in a museum, the Sasquatch belongs to a different operating system of the ancient world. It is a spectral existence, blurry as a ghost, forever lurking at the periphery of vision, defying every attempt at classification by the human brain. It serves as a haunting reminder that the world still has strata layers of truth that modern civilization has never managed to touch. Its presence in the liminal zone creates an unsettling paradox. It is far too real to be dismissed as fiction, yet far too elusive to be confirmed as a purely biological entity. It stands there, at the threshold of the deep woods, simultaneously watching humanity and shrouding itself in the shadows. Once we begin to accept that the Sasquatch is a part of this middle ground, we start to understand why it wears so many different faces in the minds of indigenous peoples. To them, this entity isn't just a vague, mysterious shadow. Sometimes, it manifests as a being with a clear purpose, a guardian deity, watching over human actions from the heights of sacred mountain peaks. This relationship brings us to another side of the Sasquatch, no longer a creature lurking in the dark to be feared, but a powerful entity with a sacred duty bestowed by creation. In the consciousness of the Lakota Sioux, this being carries a name of profound reverence, a name that reminds humans of their responsibility and humility toward the wilderness they share. That reverence is crystallized in the figure of Chianka, the great elder brother, an entity that exists not to threaten, but to guard the fragile balance between man and Mother Nature. In the Lakota Sioux cosmology, the boundary between man and nature isn't defined by dominion, but by a silent pact of respect. There, the entity we call Bigfoot doesn't manifest as a mindless beast or a drifting ghost. They call him Chianka, the great elder brother. This name carries a massive spiritual weight, positioning the entity not as a stranger, but as a high-ranking member of the family of all things, a silent observer guarding the sanctity of the land. Chianka doesn't show himself to those hunting for fame or seeking a cheap thrill. He only reveals himself to those who still hold reverence for the ancient ways, those who understand that every mountain and every stream possesses its own soul. For the Lakota, the presence of the elder brother is proof that the balance of the world is being maintained. He isn't a creature to be feared with the raw instinct of prey, but a reminder of humility, a reminder that humanity is not the master of all its surveys, and that true wisdom lies in learning to coexist with the things we can never fully comprehend. This entity acts as a messenger of the Creator. When Chianca appears, it is often a warning. It signals that man has strayed from the righteous path, that the natural balance is being disrupted by human greed or a lack of respect. In this context, the Sasquatch becomes an ecological conscience, a physical manifestation of the untamed wild, standing there to judge whether we are worthy of sharing the bounty of the old growth. We often think of the wilderness as a void waiting to be filled by man, but the stories of Chianca flip that paradigm on its head. It teaches that the forest is never empty, even when no human is in sight, and that invisible footsteps are always watching to ensure that man doesn't take more than he truly needs. This is a covenant. Human safety is traded for the respect given to the true masters of the wild. Yet, this sacred, protective presence isn't the only face of the myth. Like every power symbol in the human psyche, this entity possesses a shadow, a harsher reflection of nature when man crosses the line. If Chianca is the light of protection and wisdom, then in the darker corners of the deep woods, the tribes speak of names that make the breath catch and the blood turn to ice. Because nature isn't just a benevolent mother, it is a ruthless executioner for the careless. When the true darkness falls and the campfire begins to die, the image of the silent guardian can quickly warp into a living nightmare, an entity that doesn't come to warn, but to collect a debt of blood and terror from those who dare trespass into forbidden territory. The wilderness never wears just one mask. If Chianca is the light of protection, then in the darkest recesses of the indigenous psyche, there has always existed an entity carved from hunger and annihilation. The tribes of the Pacific Northwest didn't just tell tales of forest guardians. They whispered in hushed tones of Sonequa, a hairy giantess with sunken eyes, and a howl that beckons children from the hollows of rotting trees. Sonequa is no protector. She is a chthonic predator, a being belonging to the shadows of the earth. The legends say she stalks the villages at night, snatching children from the safety of their parents' embrace to carry them deep into the timber and devour them. This isn't merely a ghost story to ensure obedience. It is a visceral symbol of what happens when an individual strays from the safety of the community and the warmth of the campfire. This dread ripples outward through stories of the Stick Indians, the stick people who dwell in the deep woods. They are described as malicious creatures who delight in deadly pranks, mimicking the voices of kin to lure lost hunters off the beaten path, driving them to madness with strange noises echoing through the dead of night. In some regions, this legend even bleeds into the horror of the Wendigo of the Ojibwe, a creature born of bitter winters, a cannibalistic hunger, and the terrible atrocities humans are capable of when pushed to the absolute brink of endurance. What we see here is a perfect binary: the elder brother and the man-eater, the deity and the devil. This duality runs through the entire indigenous belief system, turning the Sasquatch into a mirror reflecting the various needs of humanity. When a community requires protection and a reminder to respect the land, they call upon Chianca. When they need to establish rigid social boundaries to ensure the survival of their young, the image of Sonequa emerges as a diagnosis of the perils of the wild. The power of these stories doesn't lie in whether they describe a biologically accurate creature. They are a sophisticated operating system of the ancient world, used to navigate the relationship between humanity and the incomprehensible darkness surrounding every settlement. This wild entity is the ambassador of the forest, a form containing both bounty and peril, both comfort and dread. In that space, the line between reality and myth is less important than the lesson learned when facing the abyss of nature. These myths have endured for centuries, their roots sinking deep into the soil long before strangers from the blue ocean ever set foot here. But as the footsteps of Western civilization began to trample these ancient trails, the collision of worldviews created a massive fracture in how we perceive the dark. The newcomers brought maps, new faiths, and the hubris of wanting to conquer everything they didn't understand. They didn't see the gods or the demons of the old growth. They only saw resources waiting to be exploited, until the wilderness itself began to strike back in a way that no map or dogma could ever explain. When the first settlers arrived in the Pacific Northwest in the 19th century, they didn't bring reverence for the spirits of the land. Their baggage consisted of axes, cadastral maps, and a steely conviction that nature was a wild force to be broken by the power of reason. They looked at the endless forests not as a living soul, but as a vast warehouse of resources waiting to be pillaged, a mere barrier on the path to building the outposts of civilization. The sheer scale of the new continent was a visceral shock to the European psyche. In their old homes, the thick woods had long been tamed. Wolves and bears were distant memories, pushed back by the relentless crawl of cities. But here, nature possessed a different magnitude entirely. The canopy was so dense that midday light felt as dim as twilight, and a hunter could hike for weeks without ever reaching the end of the Emerald Sea. The towering mountains, draped in eternal snow, made the European Alps look small and quaint. This was a space where humans truly felt unwelcome, a primordial landscape far beyond any measure of control. These settlers carried their own ghosts. Tucked away in their cultural memory were images of woodwoos, the wild men of medieval lore, or trolls hiding beneath Scandinavian bridges, and the green men carved into the walls of ancient cathedrals. But nothing in their old-world experience could prepare them for the vastness and brutality of the North American wilderness. As they began to hear the indigenous tales of Sasquatch, these newcomers stood at a threshold of thought. Most chose contempt. They dismissed reports of a giant, bipedal creature as the primitive superstitions of a people not yet enlightened by the hammer of science and new faith. For the machinery of civilization, acknowledging an untamable entity in its own backyard was an insult to its dreams of total dominance. They erected logging camps and mines in the heart of the oldest groves, felling trees older than their own recorded history, just to assert their claim of ownership. But the silence of the old growth has its own way of answering, and it was far from quiet. Even the most weathered settlers, the trappers and miners who slept under the open sky and stared down grizzlies without blinking, began to feel an unease crawling through their bones. It was the sensation of being watched by an unknown intelligence from behind the tree line. Massive humanoid footprints began to appear around their work sites, sometimes pressed so deep they sank into the hard earth. Strange sounds, howls that tore through the night, unlike any known animal, began to make even the hardest men white-knuckle their rifles. Suddenly, the native myths were no longer alien stories for the faint of heart. The settlers began to realize that their predecessors on this land had learned something profound during 15,000 years of living with the dark. A simple but terrifying truth, that this world was not created solely for mankind, and that secrets have always waited just beyond the light of the campfire. Initial disdain was slowly replaced by a gnawing, anxious curiosity. This collision of worldviews laid the foundation for what would eventually define the modern history of Bigfoot. Reports were no longer just vague oral traditions. They began to be documented by named witnesses, men of standing in the mining and logging communities. These encounters carried a new weight, coming from those who valued cold reality over flighty imagination. From these shaken skepticisms, the first reports of modern history began to surface in local newspapers, turning timber camp whispers into public debate. Scattered records from the early 19th century through the bizarre captures of the late century opened a new chapter, where the legend began to leave undeniable tracks in the annals of a new civilization. This curiosity soon solidified into factual reports as hunters and explorers began to record more concrete evidence of the creature's presence, marking the metamorphosis of the Sasquatch from a forest spirit into a subject of modern historical scrutiny. When the shadows of the pioneer era began to yield to the chronicles of a new age, the whispers of Sasquatch were no longer confined to indigenous circles. They began to seep into the journals of explorers, fur trappers, and the pages of local newsprint, creating the first fractures in the wall of Western skepticism. These reports weren't penned by dreamers, but by weathered men who valued hard precision over tall tales. In 1811, a British fur trader named David Thompson stumbled upon strange tracks in the snow in the Canadian Rockies. Thompson was not a man easily fooled. He was a veteran explorer and mapmaker who had spent his life measuring and naming the wilderness. He documented footprints 14 inches long, displaying features entirely distinct from any animal he had ever known. This event, though isolated for decades, marked the moment the first professional observer acknowledged the presence of an alien entity. In 1884, another event rocked Victoria, British Columbia. The British colonist newspaper ran a bizarre story about a group of railway workers near the town of Yale who had captured a creature they called Jacko. Jacko was described as a man-like entity covered in black hair, possessing extraordinary strength and a look that wasn't quite human. The creature was found near the tracks and held for further study. To this day, whether Jacko was a real biological entity, a case of misidentification, or a product of the era's sensationalist yellow journalism, remains a subject of heated debate. No records confirm Jacko's ultimate fate, but the story added another haunting piece to the growing collection of encounters with the wild man. By 1904, near the Sixes River in Oregon, settlers began reporting frequent run-ins with a wild man. It was described as a tall, hair-covered entity that walked upright and frequently loitered near their homesteads. These descriptions matched indigenous accounts of Siitko, the wild ones living in the deepest reaches of the forest, with eerie precision. As terrified settlers struggled to explain what they had seen, they realized their native neighbors already had a vocabulary for that specific brand of fear. These scattered reports, from tracks in the snow to dramatic captures, built a foundation for the belief that something truly lurked in the deep woods. They were no longer just oral ghost stories. They had become part of the historical record. Yet, all these accounts would soon be eclipsed by an event in the summer of 1924 on the slopes of Mount Street. Helens, an incident so brutal and bizarre, it became the cornerstone of the entire Bigfoot mythos in the 20th century. It wasn't just a fleeting glimpse. It was a direct confrontation between man and an unknown force. In a remote gorge that would later be known as Ape Canyon, 5 miners prepared for a routine gold hunt, unaware they were about to step into one of the darkest and most controversial chapters in the history of the American wilderness. In the summer of 1924, on the southeastern slopes of Mount Street Helens, a group of miners established a gold claim in a remote gorge they called Vanderwhite. Fred Beck, Marion Smith, Roy Smith, Gabe Lefevre, and John Peterson were not greenhorns. They were seasoned men, accustomed to sleeping under the open sky and weathering the brutal indifference of the wilderness. They chose this spot for its isolation, a place with zero competition and plenty of fresh water from the mountain springs. But the very isolation they sought became the trap that would soon cage them in a visceral nightmare. In the days leading up to what the world would later call the Ape Canyon incident, the miners noticed unsettling signs around their camp. Massive humanoid footprints appeared in the soft earth near the creek bed, some measuring 19 inches long. Eerie whistles echoed from the deep timber, and the heavy thudding of something immense moving at the edge of their clearing haunted their nights. At first, they joked about it. Maybe it was a bear, maybe an elk, or maybe their own minds playing tricks after too many lonely nights in the old growth. But skepticism vanished when Fred Beck saw the entity with his own eyes. That afternoon, while hiking along a ridge with Marion Smith, Beck spotted a dark shape moving between the massive fir trees. The creature stood upright on 2 legs, about 7 feet tall, its entire body covered in a coat of dark hair. The most terrifying thing wasn't its size, it was the way it watched them. Beck later described the creature's eyes as projecting a near-human intelligence, not the gaze of a mindless beast, but that of a predator measuring its opponent. Fear and the instinct for self-preservation overrode reason. Marion Smith raised his rifle and fired 3 consecutive shots. The creature spun and vanished into the timber with a speed that seemed impossible for such a massive frame. The 2 men scrambled back toward the cabin, trying to convince themselves that whatever they had hit was surely dead or, at the very least, driven off. They believed the power of their firearms had restored the hierarchy between man and nature. They had made a terrible mistake. They had turned a curious encounter into a war, and the silent Vanderwhite Gorge was now a liminal battlefield, a place where the line between hunter and prey had been erased. As darkness began to shroud the canyon, bringing a silence more lethal than anything they had ever felt, the men inside the cabin realized they were no longer the masters of this land. Something in the woods was waiting for the sun to fully set to collect a debt from the trespassers who had opened fire on its kind. The miners lit their lanterns, loaded their ammunition, and barricaded the door, eyes glued to the cracks between the log walls. They had no idea that the coming assault would be unlike anything a bear or a human enemy could execute. The midnight silence of the street, Helen's wilderness, was torn apart by the first crack of stone against wood, marking the beginning of a siege that would last until dawn or night. Where the rules of civilization collapsed, before the primordial rage of creatures the world still believed only existed in myth. The sound of rocks hammering the cabin walls echoed like a death knell in the stillness, the opening act of a terrifying white night that history would remember as the siege of the ape men at Ape Canyon, where fear was no longer an emotion, but a physical presence trying to smash through the thin door of reality. The first stone slammed into the cabin wall just after midnight. It wasn't the knock of a visitor. It was the roar of primordial hostility tearing through the still night. The miners had barricaded themselves inside, rifles loaded, eyes glued to the narrow gaps between the logs. When the attack erupted, it didn't come from a single direction. It seemed to descend from everywhere at once, as if the forest itself were trying to crush the foreign object, invading its domain. Rocks the size of human heads hammered the timber walls with such force that the entire structure shuddered on its foundation. Several stones shattered the mud chinking between the logs, spraying debris into the shanty. Outside, the once silent space was filled with a symphony of the macabre, the heavy thud of footsteps pounding the earth, low, guttural growls, and the chaotic movement of multiple massive bodies surrounding the house. Fred Beck and his crew fired into the dark through the cracks, aiming at blurred silhouettes they could only faintly identify under the starlight. They burned through their ammunition in an hours-long panic as the lithic bombardment continued without mercy. The peak of that visceral fear occurred when an entity tried to breach the door. Suddenly, a massive hairy hand thrust through a large gap in the wall and lunged for an axe kept inside. The miners fired point blank at the arm, forcing it to retreat back into the blackness. It wasn't just an assault, it was an eviction notice. When dawn finally broke over the canyon, the entities retreated into the deep timber. Fred Beck, standing at the door with a rifle still warm to the touch, caught a glimpse of one of them at the canyon's edge. He took aim and pulled the trigger. According to Beck's account, the creature tumbled hundreds of feet into the abyss below. The miners didn't stop to investigate or gather evidence. They abandoned everything: their gold claims, expensive equipment, and all their supplies, just to flee down the mountain as fast as humanly possible. They reached the town of Kelso in a state of total exhaustion, telling a story so wild that local newspapers initially believed they had been drinking or were suffering from hallucinations. But these miners never recanted, though the U.S. Forest Service later investigated the scene and reached skeptical conclusions, suggesting it might have been a prank by local youths. The stones scattered around the cabin, and the physical damage stood as silent witnesses to a much harsher truth. The events at Ape Canyon did more than leave marks on wood and stone. They burned a permanent scar into the minds of the survivors. For Fred Beck, the experience didn't end when he left the mountain. In fact, it was the starting point of a lifelong obsession, as he began to realize that what they faced that night couldn't be explained by conventional biological laws. Those entities, in Beck's eyes, began to take on a spectral form, leading him to a worldview where the boundary between reality and other dimensions began to blur into one. The connection between humanity and these creatures had shifted from a physical encounter to a cognitive exploration. Beck no longer viewed them as rare beasts waiting to be classified, but as entities belonging to an entirely different order of the universe, where the rules of modern civilization are merely a thin veil draped over an eternal and terrifying truth. After fleeing the horrors of Ape Canyon, the 5 miners carried a psychological scar that would never truly heal. While his companions chose the safety of silence to avoid the biting scrutiny of the public, Fred Beck walked a different path. He dedicated the rest of his life not just to defending the truth of that night, but to decoding the true nature of the beings that had besieged them. To Beck, that experience wasn't a brush with wildlife. It was a confrontation with entities that existed far beyond the borders of biological knowledge. Decades after the event, Beck released a small publication with a defiant title, "I Fought the Ape Men of Mount Street Helens." In those pages, he executed a crucial pivot in the history of the legend, putting forward a bold hypothesis. He argued that these creatures were not merely undiscovered primates, but entities from another dimension, beings that inhabited the void between the physical world and something far stranger. Beck's approach provided a new framework to explain the impossible elusiveness of Bigfoot. If they didn't belong entirely to the physical world, then the scientific failure to find remains or concrete biological proof became easier to swallow. Beck viewed them as spectral entities, ghosts capable of stepping through the various strata of reality at will. His worldview transformed the Sasquatch from a simple forest monster into a cosmological mystery, woven into the very fabric of the universe. Despite the mockery from authorities and the dismissive reports of forest rangers, who claimed the attack was nothing more than a local prank, Beck never recanted. He never took back a single word. He believed the firepower from their rifles that night didn't just pierce hair and hide. It tore through the veil, hiding the truth about the world. His conviction turned Ape Canyon into a cornerstone, a catalyst that ignited the flames of Bigfoot research throughout the 20th century. The 1924 incident established the template for every Bigfoot report that followed. The remote wilderness setting, the massive tracks, a terrifying encounter, and the inevitable official denial. It transformed vague indigenous legends into something that could happen to any ordinary American citizen. The myth no longer lived only in campfire tales. It began to gather strength in the shadows of the Pacific Northwest, waiting for the right moment to explode into the national consciousness. That moment arrived in the late 1950 seconds, as the heavy machinery of industry pushed deeper into the old-growth forests of California. What Fred Beck saw on Mount Street, Helen's was about to repeat itself in a new form, one that was more public and more shocking than ever before. An obscure logging road would accidentally swing open the gates, leading an entire nation into the fever of the hunt for the creature known as Bigfoot. In August 1958, a road crew was pushing deep into the heart of the remote wilderness near Bluff Creek in Northern California. They were cutting a logging road through some of the most rugged terrain in the American West, carving through forests that had stood firm since long before the first Europeans set foot on the continent. It was brutal, dangerous work, where men faced the raw indifference of nature head-on. One morning, a tractor operator named Jerry Crew arrived at the site and discovered something that froze him in his tracks. Pressed deep into the soft loam of the road they were building were footprints. They were massive humanoid tracks, each measuring roughly 16 inches long and sinking deep into the earth. The prints led down the road, cut across the cleared site, and vanished into the tree line, as if whatever had made them had nonchalantly strolled through the construction zone in the dead of night before continuing its journey. Crew called his colleagues over. They quickly realized these weren't the tracks of a bear, nor were they the clumsy impressions of someone in a costume. The prints showed clear toe marks, a defined heel, and a depth that suggested a creature weighing hundreds of pounds. Over the next several weeks, the tracks became a haunting repetition. Every morning, the workers found fresh prints crisscrossing their work zone, sometimes circling the parked heavy machinery or creeping right up to the edge of the camp before retreating back into the timber. Whatever was making them seemed curious about this human intrusion into its domain, yet it remained a ghost in the shadows. The workers began to whisper about the old stories, the 1924 attack at Ape Canyon, and the indigenous legends. Perhaps those tales weren't just superstition after all. Jerry Crew decided he needed to preserve the evidence. Using plaster of Paris, he cast one of the clearest tracks, lifting from the ground a permanent record of the phantom visitor. The cast revealed a foot 16 inches long and 6 inches wide, with 5 distinct toes. When Crew took this cast to the offices of the Humboldt Times in Eureka, California, he hoped only for a small mention in the local news. But Andrew Genzoli, an editor at the paper, recognized the visceral pull of the story. On the 5th of October 1958, Genzoli published an article about the mysterious tracks at the logging site, accompanied by a photograph of Jerry Crew holding his plaster cast. To hook the readers, the headline needed a name that was catchy and impossible to forget. Genzoli chose Bigfoot. The name was perfect, simple, descriptive, and it immediately took root in the public imagination. Within days, the story was picked up by newspapers across California and then the entire United States. Bluff Creek was suddenly famous, besieged by the curious and by reporters desperate to see the tracks for themselves. Jerry Crew, who had only wanted his discovery to be taken seriously, found himself at the center of a media firestorm. This event transformed a regional myth into a national obsession, moving beyond the campfire stories of trappers and miners. Bigfoot was no longer an obscure name. It had become a mystery that demanded an investigation. The The timing of the story couldn't have been better for a legend. America in 1958 was a nation perched on the edge of anxiety, simultaneously fascinated and terrified by the unknown. As man-made satellites began to drift overhead, proving the sky was no longer the limit, the idea of an undiscovered creature lurking in the backyard hit a primal chord, a longing for the last remaining wonders of the world. Bigfoot became an overnight sensation, thriving in a unique cultural moment where the fear of the modern and the curiosity about a primordial past began to bleed into one. America in the late 1952 was a nation defined by contradiction, charging into the future at jet speed, while simultaneously being besieged by invisible anxieties. This was an era of unprecedented growth, but also a time when humanity began to feel small against a rapidly widening universe. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik into orbit, proving that the sky was no longer an inviolable border. In that instant, the world suddenly felt more crowded, and the unknowns of outer space began to flood the public consciousness. The rise of the Bigfoot phenomenon was no historical coincidence. It was a manifestation of the zeitgeist. As people turned their eyes toward the stars in search of alien civilizations, they also began glancing into the dark corners of their own backyards. UFO reports thickened, and even the most serious minds began to wonder if we were truly alone. Bigfoot filled a similar liminal void, an undiscovered creature, evading the surveillance of modern science right in the heart of the American woods. We can view Bigfoot as a mirror, a reflection of a primal hunger for wonder in an age of clinical, dry explanations. As maps became obsessively detailed and satellites began photographing the Earth from orbit, the idea of an ancient entity, still walking free in the deep timber, became a form of psychological resistance. It offered a flicker of hope that the natural world was still larger and stranger than we had been led to believe. It was a synthesis of our fear of the unknown and a desperate longing to reconnect with our own primordial essence. In the anxious climate of the Cold War, Bigfoot functioned as a secular mythology. It wasn't a god or a spirit in a religious sense, but it wasn't a common beast subject to ordinary biological laws either. It inhabited the space between belief and evidence, a spectral existence forever lurking in plain sight, yet never truly caught. To the American public of that era, Bigfoot was the incarnation of the untamed wild, a haunting reminder that nature still keeps its most private secrets. The legend spread like a contagion through popular culture. Hunters, woodsmen, and even city dwellers began to watch the tree line with different eyes. Unexplained sounds in the night or blurred shapes in the shadows now carried a heavy new meaning. The 1,958 events at Bluff Creek had given the legend a name and a preliminary file of evidence, but it still lacked the one thing required to become an immortal icon, a vivid, concrete image that the world could look in the eye. The hunger for tangible proof became urgent as scientific skepticism mounted against public fascination. People were no longer satisfied with plaster casts or second-hand accounts. They needed something that could be analyzed, measured, and debated on a screen. And, as if by some dark design of fate, just 9 years after the name Bigfoot was coined, two men with a rented camera stepped into the very same territory where Jerry Crew found those first tracks, prepared to capture the footage that would change the trajectory of the myth forever. They carried a fierce conviction that the wilderness was still hiding a great truth, and they were willing to venture deep into the jagged canyons of Northern California to find it. The journey of Roger Patterson and Bob Gimlin wasn't just a scouting trip. It was an attempt to seize the shadow of an entity that had eluded humanity for millennia, dragging it out of the hazy threshold and into the unforgiving glare of the camera lens. As the 50s closed with the name Bigfoot etched into the public mind, the hunger for evidence more vivid than silent footprints in the dirt became an obsession. This longing led two men from Yakima, Washington, into the heart of Northern California's old growth in October 1967. They weren't looking for gold or timber. They were searching for a truth that could rewrite history. Roger Patterson, a man of relentless energy and passion, had spent nearly a decade chasing reports of the creature. Beside him was Bob Gimlin, a weathered horseman who joined the expedition with the quiet curiosity of a mountain man. They carried a rented 16mm camera and a fierce conviction that the wilderness had not yet surrendered all its secrets. On October 20th, While riding along the bed of Bluff Creek, the same place Jerry Crew found those first tracks 9 years earlier, their world collided with primordial reality. The horses suddenly bolted, snorting and stomping in a state of agitation. The animal's instincts had identified something outside the inventory of ordinary nature, a presence that made every prey animal tremble. Patterson leaped from his horse, camera in hand, and started to run. Across the creek, about 100 feet away, a massive, hair-covered shape was rising from a crouched position. It didn't flee in a panic like typical forest beasts. It walked with a gait that was fluid and commanding. It was a rolling stride, knees slightly bent, long arms swinging to the rhythm of a body weighing hundreds of pounds. In 59 seconds of grainy, blurred film, Patterson captured the moment that would become the most controversial piece of evidence in cryptid history. The most haunting moment happens in the middle of the footage. The creature rotates its upper body to look back at the camera. That gaze didn't carry aggression, but a distant composure, as if it were observing uninvited guests before continuing its journey into the darkness of the canopy. Later researchers dubbed the entity in the film Patty, after noticing distinct female characteristics on its body. Patty wasn't just an image. She was a defiant bipedal entity, a creature walking upright with broad shoulders, and a physical structure that bypassed every human standard. The Patterson-Gimlin film created a permanent pivot for the Bigfoot legend. It shifted the debate from lifeless tracks to a vivid entity that could be observed, measured, and analyzed frame by frame. Patty became an immortal image, replayed millions of times across the globe, serving as a perfect Rorschach test. Where believers saw a relic of the ancient world, skeptics saw only a sophisticated hoax. Yet, real or fake, those 59 seconds of film gave the wilderness a specific face. It proved that even in the age of science and machinery, the world could still harbor unanswered secrets. Patty stepped out of the hazy threshold of indigenous myth and straight into the light of modern history, leaving an unresolved question about whether we truly understand what lurks behind the Great Green Veil. Those blurred images didn't end Patterson's search. Instead, they ignited a new wave of exploration, driving the most sober minds from academia out of the lab and into the deep woods. Because if Patty is real, our entire understanding of evolution and the structure of the natural world must be rewritten from scratch. That urge led men with degrees and professional reputations to embark on a journey fraught with ridicule, where they struggled to dissect every muscle and stride of the creature on film in search of a validation that mainstream science has always refused to grant. The Patterson-Gimlin film isn't just a blurry snippet of history. It is an anatomical puzzle that challenges anyone brave enough to dissect the truth behind those 16mm grains. The entity captured, affectionately dubbed Patty by researchers, has sat at the center of microscopic scrutiny for over half a century. To believers, Patty isn't some clumsy Hollywood ape suit from the 60s. She is a bipedal organism possessing mechanical traits that the technology of that era simply could not replicate. One of the most haunting points of debate is the ripple of muscle beneath the fur. As Patty strides, one can observe the natural contraction and extension of the thigh and calf muscles, a sophisticated effect that even the premier creature shops of the time failed to simulate convincingly. Supporters of the film's authenticity argue that creating a suit with functioning musculature would have required a level of engineering far beyond the reach of Roger Patterson, a man who was, at the time, struggling to keep his head above water financially. In terms of proportions, Patty's body screams of the uncanny. Her arms are too long, her shoulders too broad, and her torso far too deep for any standard human frame. Anthropologist Grover Krantz, after an exhaustive frame-by-frame analysis, calculated that if this creature were flesh and blood, she would stand between 7 and 8 feet tall and weigh upwards of 500 to 700 pounds. Krantz was particularly fixated on the bent knee gait, a stride where the knees remained slightly flexed throughout the step, a movement he believed was the hallmark of a massive biological entity, managing extreme weight. At the Bluff Creek site, Patterson and Gimlin also recovered plaster casts that revealed a crucial anatomical detail known as the metatarsal break. This is a specific flexibility in the middle of the foot found in great apes to help them grip branches, but it is entirely absent in modern humans. Jeff Meldrum, a professor of anatomy at Idaho State University, and owner of the world's largest collection of Bigfoot track casts, argues that a hoaxer in 1967 would be unlikely to know such obscure anatomical nuances. Meldrum even identified what appears to be a muscle hernia on the creature's thigh, bulging and shifting naturally with every stride. However, the skeptics possess a logic that is equally cold and cutting. Primatologist John Napier, one of the first scientists to formally analyze the footage, concluded that the creature's gait was simply too human to be an undiscovered ape. He argued that the arm swing, stride length, and hip rotation could all be mimicked by a human walking with an exaggerated, heavy-set swagger. Skeptics also point to Roger Patterson's own history of financial desperation and his burning desire to produce a sensational climax for the documentary he was filming. 50 years have bled away, and the film still stands in that liminal space between hard evidence and cultural myth. The graininess of the film acts as both a shield, protecting the legend from final debunking, and a barrier, preventing it from ever entering the halls of mainstream science. Patty refuses to be solved. For every promising anatomical discovery, there is a heavy-handed rebuttal, turning these 59 seconds of film into an eternal loop of curiosity. But for those who staked their reputations on this footage, Patty is more than an image on a screen. She is a summons into the wild to seek vindication. The most courageous scientists have accepted ridicule and marginalization by their peers to defend what they see as a great, hidden truth. Their war is fought not just in labs, but in the deepest woods, hoping that one day, the final piece of evidence will emerge to burn away the fog of doubt forever. Mainstream science has never been a sanctuary for those who wander beyond the borders of its written laws. To most researchers, Bigfoot isn't a mystery worth investigating. It's a closed file, a textbook example of how witness testimony can fail and how the human brain is hardwired to find patterns in the static. Yet, in the shadows of that dismissal, a few rebels emerged, men with degrees and professional reputations, who were willing to stake everything on the question of whether Bigfoot truly exists. They persisted, weathering the ridicule of their peers to defend the belief that the evidence deserved a grave and serious trial. Grover Krantz was the heavyweight of these early academic champions. A professor of physical anthropology at Washington State University, Krantz originally carried the cold skepticism of a pure scientist, once dismissing the Patterson-Gimlin film as an obvious hoax. But his disbelief crumbled after he meticulously analyzed track casts from across the Pacific Northwest. Krantz identified a key anatomical detail: the metatarsal break, a flexible joint in the middle of the foot that allows great apes to grip branches. This was a trait known only to experts in primate anatomy, a detail virtually impossible for a 1,960 seconds hoaxer to fake. His conviction cost him dearly. It led to years of professional exile, denied promotions, and the evaporation of research grants. Picking up the torch where Krantz let it fall was Jeff Meldrum, a professor of anatomy at Idaho State University. Meldrum applied modern anatomical analysis to a collection of thousands of plaster casts he had amassed over the years. He faced a wall of skepticism and even outright hostility from his own institution, where colleagues viewed his interest in Bigfoot as a stain on the university's reputation. Yet, Meldrum maintained his resolve, believing these tracks bore the signature of a mechanical structure consistent with a massive animal carrying significant weight. While Krantz and Meldrum focused on bone and footprint, others sought validation from the highest seats of power. Peter Byrne, an Irish explorer, made an unprecedented demand of the FBI in 1976. He had recovered hair and tissue samples from a supposed encounter site and wanted the Bureau's crime lab to analyze them. The FBI made a rare exception for the sake of scientific inquiry. A year later, the verdict came down. The samples belonged to a deer. Despite the crushing disappointment, these researchers were undeterred, believing that one negative result could not dismantle the mountain of evidence that continued to grow in the dark. These men built an infrastructure of conviction, complete with conferences, journals, and standardized field protocols. They created a multi-generational, organized effort to answer a question that most of the scientific world refused to touch. Yet, the tragedy of these rebels lay in the fact that they were always being asked to prove a negative. They could collect 10,000 footprints and record 1,000 howls, but it would never be enough without the gold standard: a physical body, a bone fragment, or undeniable genetic proof. Until the day Grover Krantz passed away in 2002, he was still waiting for that final vindication from mainstream science, something that remains elusive to this day. The efforts of these rebels ensured that the Bigfoot legend remained more than just a superstition. It became a mystery guarded by the most sober of minds. But as the laboratory lights grew sharper, and as the technology to decode life reached the molecular level, human hope began to face the cold, clinical judgment of DNA. The story of Bigfoot has now moved out of the thick timber and into the test tube, where double helix strands have begun to tell a different story. A story of biological truth that is often far more ruthless and sterile than the shapes we long to see in the shadows of the old growth. Mainstream science has no room for romantic sentiment or the hazy ambiguities of campfire myths. To the researchers sitting behind the glass of a laboratory, Bigfoot is not an invitation to explore a mystery. It is a file already settled by the stark absence of physical evidence. While cryptid hunters lose themselves in howls and blurry shadows, biologists pose a cold, definitive question. Where is the genetic data? For decades, every sample alleged to be from a Bigfoot, from tufts of hair snagged on barbed wire to desiccated scraps of tissue found in the deep woods, has been fed into the machinery of modern analysis. Yet, the results always yield an inexorable disappointment. A 2014 study by the Royal Society dealt a fatal blow to the hopes of believers. Scientists collected 36 samples from across the globe, items claimed to belong to Bigfoot, the Yeti, or other cryptids. When the DNA maps were decoded, the veil of mystery collapsed to reveal a naked reality. Every single sample matched known animals like brown bears, American black bears, wolves, deer, horses, and even domestic cows. Science doesn't just reject the myth through DNA, it rejects it through the cold laws of population biology. For a massive primate species to exist and sustain its lineage across thousands of years in a territory as vast as North America, there would need to be a population of at least several thousand individuals to avoid a genetic collapse from inbreeding. A population of that scale simply cannot remain hidden in a landscape as meticulously surveyed as our modern world. Every large mammal we know leaves a continuous trail. Rotting carcasses, eroded bones surfacing from the earth, or scat that any experienced hunter can identify. Bigfoot, by contrast, remains entirely invisible to every modern surveillance system. This is the paradigm of scientific skepticism. Extraordinary claims demand extraordinary evidence. Scientists argue that the human brain is a hypersensitive pattern recognition machine, prone to manufacturing explanations from chaotic data. A bear standing on its hind legs for a few seconds, a shadow falling across a pile of dry timber, or the slow distortion of memory over time can all conjure a false encounter. To the scientific mind, Bigfoot does not dwell in the deep woods. It lives within the architecture of human expectation and cognitive bias. Yet, the clinical verdict of the laboratory has never been enough to extinguish the flame of belief. Even when the DNA says no, the hearts of millions still cry yes. This contradiction leads us to an even more ironic and bitter truth, that sometimes the very evidence we consider the bedrock of the entire myth was forged by the cunning hands of men. Because before Patty appeared on screen, and before scientists began extracting DNA, the modern Bigfoot legend was birthed from a long-running prank by a logger with a pair of wooden feet. The exposure of these hoaxes has forced us to question the integrity of every piece of evidence we hold. When the atoms of belief are fractured by deceit, the myth is forced to evolve to survive, starting with a late-coming confession from the family of Ray Wallace, the man who turned an obscure logging site into the cradle of a global fever. In November 2002, Ray Wallace passed away at the age of 84, carrying secrets he had guarded for nearly half a century. It was then that his family decided the veil of truth finally had to be lifted. Wallace, a veteran logging contractor in the Pacific Northwest, was more than just a rugged businessman. According to his kin, he was one of the most successful hoaxers in American history. He had spent 44 years quietly watching the entire world obsess over a creature he had helped manufacture as a prank. At a shocking press conference shortly after Ray's death, his son and nephew produced undeniable evidence: crudely carved wooden feet. It was these 16-inch wooden shoes that created the tracks at Bluff Creek in 1958, fooling Jerry Crew and transforming the name Bigfoot into a global phenomenon. Ray Wallace had strapped these wooden feet to his boots and stomped around logging sites to spook his workers, never imagining his joke would spiral out of control and become national news. When the story exploded, Wallace realized he loved the attention and continued to stage fake encounters, throwing more fuel onto the fire of public belief. This is a bitter paradox. The foundation of the modern myth, the very name Bigfoot, was birthed from total fabrication. By all rights, this confession should have been the final nail in the coffin of the legend. But something strange happened. The Bigfoot research community didn't disintegrate. Instead, it displayed a staggering resilience. They argued that Wallace's wooden feet didn't perfectly match the original casts, and more importantly, one hoaxer couldn't account for the thousands of other reports across the continent that had nothing to do with him. The deception, rather than weakening the faith, unintentionally became a mechanism for refining it. Believers could now discard the evidence poisoned by Wallace to focus on what they considered a purer, more authentic core. Ray Wallace was dead, but the child he created from wood and wit had detached itself from its father to become an independent entity in the human imagination. It proved that an idea, an archetype once rooted deeply in the psyche, is notoriously difficult to kill with mere dry facts. The Bigfoot legend survived the Wallace scandal by evolving into a story of persistence against suppression. But when we look beyond the forests of California to view Bigfoot through a wider lens, we realize this phenomenon isn't unique. Massive footprints and hair-covered figures have appeared across the globe, from the highest peaks to the most remote continents. Bigfoot might have started with a pair of wooden feet in America, but its deep roots may lie in something universal, a biological memory or a prehistoric relic still lurking in the blood of humanity. The rise of similar entities in different cultures suggests that Bigfoot isn't just the product of a long-running prank, but a piece of a much larger puzzle. To understand why these silhouettes haunt us so deeply, we must leave North America for the eternal snows of the Himalayas and the wild red earth of Australia, where entities like the Yeti and the Yowie tell the same story of giant walkers who went extinct, or perhaps are still waiting to be found. This global connection brings us to a staggering possibility. Are these myths residual memories of a real giant ape that once dominated the earth, an entity named Gigantopithecus, the final bridge between biological truth and the mystical human imagination? Bigfoot is far from alone on this planet. Across the globe, cultures separated by vast oceans and centuries of isolation have spawned near-identical legends of massive, bipedal, hair-covered beings inhabiting wildernesses beyond human control. From the Yeti of the Himalayas to the Yowie of Australia, dozens of regional variations share the same core DNA: a humanoid silhouette, extraordinary size, and an uncanny ability to evade scientific detection. This global distribution suggests a staggering possibility. Either an unidentified primate has persisted across multiple continents, or something deep within the human psyche independently breeds these stories wherever we settle. The Yeti has haunted the Himalayas for centuries, known in the West as the Abominable Snowman. In 1951, British mountaineer Eric Shipton captured a photograph of a startlingly clear footprint during an Everest expedition, an image that thrust the Yeti into the international spotlight, much like the 1,958 tracks did for Bigfoot. However, when scientists finally subjected hair and bone samples from Tibetan monasteries to DNA analysis, the mystery dissolved into a clinical letdown. Every sample belonged to known animals: the Himalayan brown bear, the Asian black bear, or even a species of mountain goat. In Australia, indigenous people have long spoken of the Yowie, hairy, man-like beings existing in oral traditions since before Europeans touched the continent. The case for the Yowie is particularly chilling because Australia has no native apes and no fossil record of primates larger than humans since the megafauna extinctions. If the Yowie exists as a biological entity, it represents something far more radical than an undiscovered ape in North America. It would be a primate that evolved or survived in a land where, theoretically, it shouldn't be possible. Science has offered an elegant explanation for part of this phenomenon: Gigantopithecus. This was a genuine giant ape that lived in southern China and Southeast Asia until roughly 300,000 years ago. At its peak, it may have been the largest ape to ever walk the earth. Its first fossilized teeth were discovered by chance in a Chinese apothecary in 1935 by anthropologist Ralph von Koenigswald. Since then, Thousands of teeth and jaw fragments have confirmed that this creature was very real and very massive. Some Bigfoot enthusiasts have proposed the hypothesis that Gigantopithecus migrated across the Bering Land Bridge into North America during the Ice Ages and survives in remote forests to this day. The theory is seductive because it links modern encounters to a real prehistoric entity. However, the hard evidence doesn't hold up. No Gigantopithecus fossils have ever been found outside of Asia, and the species went extinct at least 200,000 years before the Bering Land Bridge could have permitted its passage. Furthermore, based on jaw structure and diet, Gigantopithecus was almost certainly a quadruped, moving like a bear or a gorilla, not a bipedal creature that walks upright like the Bigfoot of legend. Perhaps what these global myths share isn't a common biological organism, but a common humanity. In every culture, humans live alongside wildernesses they cannot fully tame or comprehend. Everywhere, they tell stories of entities that are almost human but not human, dwelling in the dark. The wild man is a universal archetype that emerges whenever humanity needs a name for the mystery surrounding them, from the deep woods, the high peaks, or the voids where social laws no longer apply. The Yeti, the Yowie, and the Bigfoot likely tell us more about the people who report them than about any creature actually existing in the wild. They represent our relationship with nature, the fear and awe we feel when facing spaces we cannot master. Every culture has its version of this story, because every culture faces the same fundamental experience, standing at the edge of the known world and wondering what waits in the darkness beyond. Perhaps it is that spiritual hunger that makes these creatures real, not as biological entities to be caged and studied, but as eternal residents of the human imagination, feeding a craving that science will never fully satisfy. The immortality of this legend brings us back to the final, deepest question: why, despite all the debunking and the cold shoulder of science, can we not stop searching? When night falls and the last light flickers out over the canopy, we realize that Bigfoot isn't just a target to be hunted, but an essential part of the human soul, a haunting reminder that the world will always keep its secrets until the very end of time. The question that truly haunts us in the end is not whether Bigfoot exists. Mainstream science has already provided a clear enough answer to that. The more compelling mystery is, why do we continue to believe? Why, after decades of rejected evidence, disappointing DNA results, and exposed hoaxes, does this legend refuse to fade? Why, instead, does it sink its roots even deeper into the modern psyche? To find the answer, we must look into the architecture of the human brain, a pattern recognition machine designed over millions of years of evolution to find meaning in the midst of chaos. The brains of our ancestors learned to see a predator in the brush, long before they had a name for it, a survival mechanism that kept humanity alive through the long, dark nights of prehistory. In the modern world, that machinery is still running. Sometimes it creates pareidolia, the tendency to see familiar images in random stimuli. A rotted stump, a shifting shadow, or a patch of matted bear fur becomes a blobsquatch, a blurred, humanoid shape born from the eyes of those desperate to find it. Once a belief is established, every strange sound or snapped branch becomes confirmation for what we already expected to see. Yet, psychology alone cannot explain the sheer pull of Bigfoot. This legend persists because it feeds a hunger that raw knowledge cannot satisfy, a hunger for the mysterious in a world that has been overmapped and overexplained. In an era where satellite imagery exposes every corner of the Earth and genetic databases have decoded life down to the molecule, Bigfoot represents a psychological resistance against the flattening of absolute knowledge. It offers hope that the natural world is still larger, stranger, and that there are still frontiers where the unexpected can happen. Today, Bigfoot has become a secular mythology, filling the void once occupied by traditional supernatural beliefs. It exists in the liminal space between the natural and the supernatural, forever lurking around the next bend of the trail, always out of reach, but never truly gone. Bigfoot has become the incarnation of our ecological conscience, a symbol reminding us to preserve the wilderness, even if we never fully know what dwells within it. Perhaps the greatest value of Bigfoot lies in the fact that it has never been caught. A Bigfoot captured, dissected, and classified in a lab would become just another animal, subject to conservation laws and dry scientific reports. Understanding kills wonder. Conversely, a Bigfoot that exists in the imagination, is infinite. It can be anything we need it to be: a guardian spirit, a symbol of the unknown, or a reminder that humans are never truly the masters of nature. Bigfoot is a mirror. What we see in it reveals what we carry in our own souls. For the indigenous people, it is a sacred boundary. For the settlers, a monster to be conquered. And for us today, it is proof that wonder still exists. All of these interpretations are true because they speak to the truth of human need. An entity that can draw us into the deep woods and teach us to pay attention to possibilities beyond reason doesn't need a biological form to be real. When night falls over the forests of the Pacific Northwest, the woods remain silent and unchanged. The ancient trees stand guard, the mist snakes through the valleys, and the shadows pull beneath the heavy canopy as they have for centuries. Whether we believe or not, the wilderness operates by its own laws. Indifferent to human attention, we are the ones who keep coming back, cameras in hand and hope in our hearts, searching for a silhouette that perhaps we created ourselves to keep us company in the loneliness of civilization. The truth of Bigfoot isn't found in whether it's out there, but in why we never stop asking the question. We are drawn to the mystery, like we are drawn to a campfire by the power of a story that has no end. In a world of certain answers, Bigfoot offers the gift of doubt, and as long as the forests remain wild enough to hold secrets, the hairy one will continue to walk, leaving footprints in the mud and in our minds, as immortal as the woods that have sheltered it for generations. The forest waits just beyond the flickering light of the campfire. A massive silhouette moves between the trunks, a fleeting glimpse that vanishes into nothingness. Perhaps it was just the wind in the leaves, or perhaps it was an ancient reality quietly watching us from the dark, satisfied to know that we have never stopped searching. A new journey begins the moment we realize that, in the labyrinth of the wild, the most precious thing isn't finding the answer, but keeping the flame of wonder alive forever.